Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Absolute Knowing, continued. This unification, however, has already occurred in principle, and that too in religion, in the return of picture thinking into self-consciousness, but not according to the proper form, for the religious aspect is the aspect of the in itself, which stands over against the movement of self-consciousness. Consequently, the unification belongs to this other aspect, which, in the contrast of the two sides, is the aspect of reflection into self, and therefore the one that contains both its own self and its opposite, and not only implicitly or in a universal sense, but explicitly or in a developed and differentiated way. The content as well as the other aspect of self-consciousness, spirit, so far as it is the other aspect, has been exhibited and is before us in its completeness. The unification that is still lacking is the single unity of the notion. The notion, too, is itself already present on the side of self-consciousness, but as it has come before us thus far, it has to be a particular shape of consciousness, like all the other moments. It is therefore that aspect of the shape of self-assured spirit that abides within its notion and was called the beautiful soul. The beautiful soul is in its own knowledge of itself. The beautiful soul is its own knowledge of itself. In its pure transparent unity, the self-consciousness that knows this pure knowledge of pure inwardness as spirit, it is not only the intuition of the divine, but the divine's intuition of itself. Since this notion holds itself firmly opposed to its realization, it is the one-sided shape which we saw vanish into thin air, but also positively externalize itself and move forward. Through this realization, this objectless self-consciousness ceases to cling to the determinateness of the notion as against its fulfillment. Its self-consciousness gains the form of universality, and what remains to it is its true notion, or the notion that has attained its realization. It is the notion in its truth, namely in unity with its externalization. It is the knowing of pure knowledge, not as an abstract essence such as duty is, but of knowledge as an essential being, which is this knowledge, this pure self-consciousness, which is therefore at the same time a genuine object, for the notion is the self that is for itself. This notion fulfilled itself on one side in the self-assured spirit that acted on the other in religion. In religion it won for consciousness the absolute content as content, or in the form of picture thinking. The form of otherness for consciousness, on the other hand, in the prior shape, the form is that of the self itself, for it contains the self-assured spirit that acts. The self accomplishes the life of absolute spirit. This shape is, as we have seen, that simple notion, which, however, surrenders its eternal essence. It is therefore in the real world, or it acts. This self-sundering, or stepping forth into existence, stems from the purity of the notion, for this is absolute abstraction or negativity. Similarly, the notion gets the element of its actuality, or the being it contains, in pure knowledge itself, for this is a simple immediacy, which is as much being and existence as it is essence. The former a negative thought, the latter a positive thought itself. Finally, this existence, both as existence and as duty, is just as much the reflectedness into self out of pure knowledge, or the state of evil. This withdrawal into self constitutes the antithesis of the notion, and is thus the emergence of the pure knowledge of the essence, the knowing that it does not act and is not actual, but this emergence in the antithesis is participation in it. The pure knowledge of essence has in principle renounced its simple unity, for it is the self-sundering, or the negativity, which the notion is, insofar as this self-sundering is the process of becoming for itself. It is evil. So far as it is in itself, it remains good. Now, what at first happens in principle is that at the same time explicitly for consciousness, and is this double. It is both for consciousness and also it is being for self or its very own act. The same thing that is already posited in principle now, therefore repeats itself as consciousness knowledge of it and conscious act. Each in relation to the other lets go of the independent determinateness with which it comes forth against it. This letting go is the same renunciation of the one-sidedness of the notion that in itself constituted the beginning, but it is now its own active renunciation, just as the notion which it renounces is its own notion, that in itself the immediacy of the beginning is in truth as negativity, no less mediated. What it is in truth, it now also makes explicit, and the negative is as determinateness of each both for the other and in itself self-suspending. One of the two parts of the antithesis is the disparity between the notions being within itself in its individuality and universality the other. The disparity between its abstract universality and the self. The former dies to its being for self, disowns itself, makes confession. The latter renounces the obstinacy of its abstract universality, and in so doing dies to the lifeless self and to its unmoved universality. The former has thus completed itself through the moment of universality, which is essence, and the latter through the universality which is self. Through this movement of action, spirit has come on the scene as a pure universality of knowing, which is self-consciousness as self-consciousness. That is the simple unity of knowing. It is only through action that spirit is in such a way that it is really there. That is, when it raises its existence into thought, and thereby into an absolute antithesis, and returns out of this antithesis, in and through the antithesis itself. Thus, what in religion was constant or a form of presenting another, is here the self's own act. The notion requires the content to be the self's own act, for this notion is, as we see, the knowledge of the self's act within itself as all essentiality and all existence. The knowledge of this subject is as substance, and of the substance as this knowledge, or of its act. Our own act here has been simply to gather together the separate moments, each of which in principle exhibits the life of spirit in its entirety, and also to stick to the notion in the form of the notion, the content of which would already have yielded itself in those moments and in the form of a shape of consciousness. This last shape of spirit, the spirit which at the same time gives its complete and true content the form of a self, and thereby realizes its notion, as remaining in its notion in this realization, this is absolute knowing. It is spirit that knows itself in the shape of spirit, or a comprehensive knowing in terms of the notion. Truth is not only in itself completely identical with certainty, but it also has the shape of self-certainty, or it is in its existence. It is in its existence in the form of self-knowledge. Truth is the content, which in religion is still not identical with its certainty, but this identity is now a fact in that the content has received the shape of the self. As a result, that which is the very essence, namely the notion, has become the element of existence, or has become the form of objectivity for consciousness. Spirit, manifesting or appearing in consciousness, in this element, or what is the same thing, produced in it by consciousness, is science. Still searching for the absolute. The nature, moment and movement of this knowing have then shown themselves to be such that this knowing is a pure being for self of self-consciousness. It is I, and this is this and no other I, and which is no less immediately immediate or suppressed universal I. It has a content which it differentiates from itself, for it is pure negativity or the dividing of itself. It is consciousness. This content is in its difference itself the I, for it is the movement of superseding itself, or the same pure negativity that the I is in it as a differentiated. The I is reflected into itself. It is only when the I communes with itself in its otherness that the content is comprehended, that is, in terms of the notion. Stated more specifically, this content is nothing else than the very movement just spoken of for the content spirit that traverses its own self and does so for itself. For the contents, I should say, spirit that traverses its own self and does so for itself as spirit by the fact that it has the shape of the notion in its objectivity. But as regards the existence of this notion, science does not appear in time and in the actual world before spirit has attained to this consciousness about itself, as spirit that knows what it is does not exist before and nowhere at all till after the completion of its work, as compelling its imperfect shape to procure for its consciousness the shape of its essence, and in this way to equate its self-consciousness with its consciousness. Spirit that is in and for itself and differentiated into its moments is a knowing that is for itself, a comprehension in general that is as such substance has not yet reached. That is, substance is not in its own self an absolute knowing. Now, in actuality, the substance that knows exists earlier than its form or its notion determined shape, for substance is the as yet undeveloped in itself, or the ground and notion in its still unmoved simplicity, and therefore the inwardness of the self, of the spirit, that does not yet exist. What is there exists as the still undeveloped simple and immediate, or as the object of the picture thinking, consciousness in general, cognition because it is the spiritual consciousness for which what is in itself only is, insofar as it is a being for the self and a being for the self or notion, has for this reason at first only a message, has only a meagre object, in contrast with which substance and the consciousness of this substance are richer. The disclosure or revelation which substance has in this consciousness is in fact concealment, for substance is still a selfless being, and what is disclosed to it is only the certainty of itself. At first, therefore, only the abstract moments of substance belong to self-consciousness, but since these as pure movements spontaneously impel themselves onward, self-consciousness enriches itself until it has wrested from consciousness the entire substance and has absorbed into itself the entire structure of the essentialities of substance. And since the negative attitude to objectivity is just as much positive, it is the positing it has produced them out of itself, and in so doing has at the same time restored them for consciousness. In the notion that knows itself as notion, the moments thus appear earlier than the fulfilled whole. There's something wrong there. I think it might be than the filled. Maybe I should be unfulfilled. I'll check later. Whole whose coming to be is the movement of those moments. In consciousness, on the other hand, the whole, though uncomprehended, is prior to the moments. Time is the notion itself that is there and which presents itself to consciousness as empty intuition. For this reason, spirit necessarily appears in time, and it appears in time just so long as it has not grasped its pure notion. That is, it has not annulled time. It is the outer intuited pure self, which is not grasped by the self, the merely intuited notion. When this latter grasps itself, it sets aside its time form, comprehends this intuiting, and is a comprehended and comprehending intuiting. Time, therefore, appears as the destiny and necessity of spirit that is not yet complete within itself, the necessity to enrich the share which a self-consciousness has in consciousness, to set in motion the immediacy of the inner self, which is the form in which substance is present in consciousness, or conversely, to realize and reveal what is at first only inward, the inner self being taken as what is inward, that is, to vindicate it for spirit's certainty of itself. For this reason, it must be said that nothing is known that is not in experience, or, as it is also expressed, that is not felt to be true, not given as an inwardly revealed eternal verity, as something sacred that is believed, or whatever other expressions have been used, for experience is just this, that the content, which is spirit, is in itself substance and therefore an object of consciousness. But this substance, which is spirit, is the process in which spirit becomes what it is in itself, and is only at this process of reflecting itself into itself that it is in itself truly spirit. It is in itself the movement which is cognition, the transforming of that in itself into that which is for itself, of substance into subject, of the object of consciousness into an object of self-consciousness, that is, into an object that is just as much superseded, or into the notion. The movement is the circle that returns into itself, the circle that presupposes its beginning and reaches it only at the end. Hence, so far as spirit is necessarily this immanent differentiation, its intuited whole appears over against its simple self-consciousness, and since then the former is what is differentiated, it is differentiated into its intuited pure notion, into time, and into the content or into the inner self. Substance is charged as subject with the at first only inward necessity of setting forth within itself what it is in itself, of exhibiting itself in spirit, as spirit. Only when the objective presentation is complete is it at the same time the reflection of substance, or the process in which substance becomes self. Consequently, until spirit has completed itself in itself, until it has completed itself as the world spirit, it cannot reach its consummation as self-conscious spirit. Therefore, the content of religion proclaims earlier in time than does science what spirit is, but only science is its true knowledge of itself. The movement of carrying forward the form of itself knowledge is the labour which accomplishes as actual history. The religious community, so far as it is at first the substance of absolute spirit, is the uncultivated consciousness whose existence is all the harsher and more barbarous the deeper its inner spirit is, and the deeper its spirit is, the harder the task that its torpid self has with its essence, with the alien content of its consciousness. Not until consciousness has given up hope of overcoming that alienation is an external, i.e. alien manner, does it turn to itself, because the overcoming of that alienation is the return into self-consciousness. Not until then does it turn into its own present world and discover it as its property, thus taking the first step towards coming down out of the intellectual world, or rather towards quickening the abstract element of that world with the actual self. Through observation it finds on the one hand existence in the shape of thought, and comprehends it, and conversely in its thinking it comprehends existence. When to begin with, it has thus expressed the immediate unity of thought and being, the unity of abstract essence and the self abstractly, and when it has expressed the primal light in the purer form, namely as unity of extension and being for extension, is a simple unity which more nearly resembles pure thought than light does, and in so doing has revived in thought the substance of the Orient. Spirit at once recoils in horror from the abstract unity, from this selfless substantiality, and against it affirms individuality. But only after it has externalized this individuality in the sphere of culture, thereby giving it an existence, and establishing it throughout the whole of existence, only after spirit has arrived at the thought of utility, and in its absolute freedom has grasped existence as its will, only then does it turn the thought of its inmost depths outwards and enunciate essence as I equals I. But this I equals I is the movement which reflects itself into itself, for since the identity, being absolute negativity, is absolute difference, the self-identity of the I stands over against this pure difference, which, as the pure and at the same time objective to the self-knowing self, has to be expressed in time, so that, just as previously essence was declared to be the unity of thought and extension, it would now have to be grasped as the unity of thought and time. But the difference left to itself, unresting and unhalting time, collapses rather within itself. It is the objective repose of extension. While extension is pure identity with itself, the I, in other words, the I is not merely the self, but the identity of the self with itself, but this identity is complete and immediate oneness with self. All the subject is just as much substance. Substance just by itself would be intuition devoid of content, or the intuition of a content which has determined it, would be only accidental and would lack necessity. Substance would pass for the absolute only insofar as it was thought or intuited as absolute unity, and all content would, as regards its diversity, have to fall outside of it into reflection, and reflection does not pertain to substance, because substance would not be subject, would not be grasped as reflecting on itself, and reflecting itself into itself would not be grasped as spirit. If a content were to be spoken of anyway, it would be on the one hand only be spoken of in order to cast it into the empty abyss of the absolute, and on the other it would be a content picked up in external fashion from sense perception. Knowledge would seem to have come by things by what is different from itself, and by the difference of a variety of things, without comprehending how and whence they came. Spirit, however, has shown itself to us to be neither merely the withdrawal of self-consciousness into its pure inwardness, nor the mere submergence of self-consciousness into substance, and the non-being of its moment of difference. But spirit is this movement of the self which empties itself of itself, and sinks itself into its substance, and also as subject has gone out of that substance into itself, making the substance into an object and a content of the same time as it cancels this difference between objectivity and content. That first reflection out of immediacy, that is the subject's differentiation of itself from its substance, or the notion's separation of itself from itself, the withdrawal into itself and the becoming of the pure I. Since this difference is the pure act of I equals I, the notion is the necessity and the uprising of existence, which has substance for its essence and subsists on its own account. But this subsistence of existence on its own account is the notion posited indeterminateness, and is thus also its immanent movement, that of going down into the simple substance, which is subject only as this negativity and movement. The I has neither to cling to itself in the form of self-consciousness as against the form of substantiality and objectivity, as if it were afraid of the externalization of itself. The power of spirit lies rather in remaining the self, save spirit in its externalization, and as that which is both in itself and for itself, in making its being for self no less immediately moment than it's in itself. Nor is spirit a tertium quid that casts differences back into the abyss of the absolute and declares that therein they are all the same. On the contrary, knowing is this seeming inactivity which merely contemplates how what is differentiated spontaneously moves in its own self and returns into its unity. In this knowing, then, the spirit has concluded the movement in which it has shaped itself, insofar as this shaping was burdened with the difference of consciousness, that is, of the latter from its object. A difference now overcome, spirit has won the pure element of its existence, the notion. The content, in accordance with the freedom of its being, is the self-alienating spirit, is the self-alienating self, or the immediate unity of self-knowledge. The pure movement of this alienation, considered in connection with the content, constitutes the necessity of the content. The distinct content as determinate is not in itself, it is its own restless process of superseding itself, or negativity. Therefore, negativity or diversity, like free being, is also the self, and in this self-like form in which existence is immediately thought, the content is the notion. Spirit, therefore, having won the notion, displays its existence and movement in this, either of its life and its science. In this, the moments of its movement no longer exhibit themselves as specific shapes of consciousness, but since consciousness's difference has returned into the self as specific notions and as their organic, self-grounded movement. Whereas in the phenomenology of spirit, each moment is the difference of knowledge and truth, and is the movement in which the difference is cancelled, science, on the other hand, does not contain the difference and the cancelling of it. On the contrary, since the moment has the form of the notion, it unites the objective form of truth and of the knowing self in an immediate unity. The movement does not appear as this movement of passing back and forth from consciousness or picture thinking into self-consciousness, and conversely, on the contrary, its pure shape freed from its appearance in consciousness, the pure notion and its onward movement depend solely on its pure determinateness. Conversely, to each abstract moment of science corresponds a shape of manifest spirit as such. Just as spirit in its existence is not richer than science, so too it is not poorer either in content. To know the pure notions of science in this form of shapes of consciousness constitutes the side of their reality in accordance with which their essence, the notion, which is posited in them in its simple mediation as thinking, breaks asunder the moments of this mediation and exhibits itself in accordance with the inner antithesis. Science contains within itself this necessity of externalizing the form of the notion, and it contains the passage of the notion into consciousness. For the self-knowing spirit, just because it grasps its notion, is the immediate identity with itself, which in its difference is the certainty of immediacy or sense consciousness, the beginning from which we started. This release of itself from the form of itself is the supreme freedom and assurance of its self-knowledge. Yet this externalization is still incomplete. It expresses the connection of its self-certainty with the object which, just because it is thus connected, has not yet won its complete freedom. The self-knowing spirit knows not only itself but also the negative of itself, or its limit. To know one's limit is to know how to sacrifice oneself. This sacrifice is the externalization in which spirit displays the process of its becoming spirit in the form of free contingent happening, intuiting its pure self as time outside of it and equally its being in space, as being as space. This last becoming of spirit, nature, is its living, immediate becoming. Nature, the externalized spirit, is in its existence nothing but this eternal externalization of its confirming existence and the movement which reinstates the subject. But the other side of its becoming, history, is a conscious, self-mediating process, spirit emptied out into time. But this externalization, this kenosis, is equally an externalization of itself. The negative is the negative of itself. This becoming presents a slow-moving succession of spirits, a gallery of images, each of which, endowed with all the riches of spirit, moves us slowly, just because the self has to penetrate and digest this entire wealth of its substance, as its fulfillment consists in perfectly knowing what it is, in knowing its substance. This knowing is its withdrawal into itself, in which it abandons its outer existence and gives its existential shape over to recollection. Thus absorbed in itself, it is sunk in the night of its self-consciousness, but in that night its vanished outer existence is preserved, and this transformed existence, the former one, but now reborn of the spirit's knowledge, is a new existence, a new world, and a new shape of spirit. In the immediacy of this new existence, the spirit has to start afresh to bring itself to maturity, as if for it all that preceded were lost, and it had learned nothing from the experience of the earlier spirits, but recollection, the inwardizing, or that experience, has preserved it and is the inner being, and in fact the higher form of the substance. So, although the spirit starts afresh and apparently from its own resources to bring itself to maturity, it is nonetheless on a higher level that it starts. The realm of spirits, which is formed in this way, in the outer world, constitutes a succession in time in which one spirit relieved another of its charge, and each took over the empire of the world from its predecessor. Their goal is the revelation of the depths of spirit, and this is the absolute notion. This revelation is therefore the raising up of its depths, or the extension, the negativity of this withdrawn I, a negativity which is its externalization, or its substance, and this revelation is also the notion's time, in that this externalization is its own self externalized. And just as it is in its extension, so it is equally in its depth, in the self The goal, absolute knowing or spirit that knows itself as spirit, has for its path the recollection of the spirits as they are in themselves and as they accomplish the organization of their realm. Their preservation, regarded from the side of their free existence, appearing in the form of contingency, is history, but regarded from the side of their philosophically comprehended organization, it is the science of knowing in the sphere of appearance. That's phenomenology. The two together, comprehended history, form alike the inwardizing and the Calvary of absolute spirit, the actuality, truth, and certainty of his throne, without which he would be lifeless and alone. Only from the chalice of this realm of spirits foams forth for him his own infinitude, or infinitude. Okay? That's from Schiller on friendship. But it's not quite accurate, because not having access to Google, when Hegel gives quotes, he often does so from memory, so they're sometimes not quite accurate. Not that that matters. From the chalice of this realm of spirits foams forth for him his own infinitude.